another set of questions that I got that kind of work together that I think is really great to think about. And again, I don't think Jung goes too far in this direction. Is first of all, is it oppression if the people being oppressed aren't aware of the oppression? So, is oppression something that we can just judge from the outside, or is oppression something that only exists if the people who it's happening to consider it to be oppression? And I think that's a really interesting question, in part because I guess my gut reaction would be to say that sure, it's oppression. If we recognize it as oppression, whether it's happening to us or to somebody else, it's oppression. But then part of me also kind of goes back to that idea of cultural imperialism or cultural dominance as she talks about it, right? Which is to say, is that me coming from a very privileged position imposing my way of thinking upon something else? And I think that just kind of complicates the issue a little bit, but I think it's a great question to have as well. I think this is something that the United States as a world power has kind of struggled with many times in terms of when do we step in, when do we impose ourselves upon another country, into another situation, and say this is wrong and we're going to stop it. And sometimes we've done that and it's been for the best. Sometimes we've done that and it's made things worse. And sometimes we've done it and we should have just kind of let things go, right? I mean, so it's a pretty uniquely ethical kind of question we're thinking about here. I think, and in terms of just the fictional, imaginary dystopias, it's also kind of interesting. Now, in The Handmaid's Tale, as we're reading it, Offred at least is fully aware of the oppression she is facing and the she and these other women are, and other people within the society are facing. She still remembers the past, the way things used to be, right? The days of anarchy, as Aunt Lydia likes to call them. And so she's able to compare that with this and say, well, I was free then and I'm not free now, therefore I'm being oppressed. Even though Aunt Lydia would always kind of constantly be telling her, no, you weren't free then, you just thought you were free. Now you're free. Now you're safe. Now you're protected. You used to be oppressed. We stopped the oppression. And it's that kind of interesting kind of attempt to erase the past and take away that comparison, right? Because again, we see that throughout the book as well. And it's a common act of any sort of authoritarian state, but definitely within these dystopias that we're going to take a look at, right? Which is to eliminate the evidence that things used to be better or could be better. Whether it's burning books, whether it's destroying films, whether it's rewriting the news. Right? Again, I always come back to 1984, the novel 1984, which again I used to read for this class, which in many ways kind of sets the standard for every dystopian novel to follow in the past 70 or so years, 75 years now, right? And that's a society in which the government literally changes the news from the past. It goes through the main character's job in that book is to change old news stories to reflect the current reality that the government wants people to believe, right? So if we're at war now with this country, or this super state, right? Because there's only basically 3 big countries in this world. And if at the time of the novel, the country is at war with a place called Eurasia, and they're actually allied with a place called East Asia. But there are old news stories where the opposite was true. They were at war with East Asia and they were allied with Eurasia. And so then the main character, Winston's job is to go and just change those news articles so that if anybody looks them up, the news from 3, 5, 10 years ago matches the reality of the moment. And so I think if we kind of say, well, oppression only counts if people realize they're being oppressed, we need to take into consideration that sometimes part of oppression is tricking people into thinking they're not oppressed. So I would kind of approach it from that angle. The other question that ties into that is intention. Is it oppression if the group doing it doesn't actually mean to be oppressive? If it's just kind of something that they do without realizing that they are being oppressive. And again, I think the history of the United States is a pretty good example of at least claims to not realizing our intentions of oppression, right? We didn't realize that was a problem. Sorry. So I would say for both of those, again, this is my personal response to both of those. My personal response to both of those is that it doesn't matter, right? If the group doesn't realize they're being oppressed, but they're still being controlled by this other group, and somehow they're still facing this violence, they're still facing this exploitation, they're still being used, whatever the case may be, then they are still being oppressed according to these descriptions, right? And whether or not the group in power that is doing the oppressing knows it or not, again, they're still oppressors. So, again, that's not a real straightforward answer, but my response to both of those is that yes, they are in fact both still acts of oppression, whether or not either group is aware of it. Great questions though.